We've seen how energy prices have been fluctuating since the time of the pandemic, and then later on the world has been suffering. Inflation is high in many of the countries. The global economy is in peril, and much of it is also connected in some way to the energy prices as well. India, for instance, Gargi, has been under pressure initially from the West that it reassesses its relationship with Russia, and that was largely because India was buying oil from Russia, which the West did not, in some sense, approve of. So they feel that the revenues from the energy export of Russia is what is fueling the Ukraine war. But India has stood its ground, and the reasons that India gave, the arguments India gave, was that India had to already cut its oil supplies from Iran in 2018 because of the unilateral US sanctions, then from Venezuela as well. For a country that is high on energy consumption, that doesn't have very high incomes, cheap modes of energy are very important for the country, and therefore it is important for many other countries in the South as well. So the South, voice of the global South, as well as speaking for itself, India stands at a summit of this nature, the G20 Summit, one with 20 biggest economies, as a voice for the global South, as I was pointing out. And for them, energy and food crisis at the moment are acute. The food crisis has also been exacerbated by the Ukraine war, because a lot of wheat had been lying in the Ukraine silos. They could not move out through the Black Sea. So India once again stressing that the requirement is that there should be a mode wherein this wheat can move, and that is why we saw an agreement that was reached between Ukraine and Russia, brokered by Turkey and the United Nations. But India also played a critical part in that, considering it has a good relationship with Russia. India tried to explain to Russia that this food crisis is very acute, especially for the African continent, and therefore that is an aspect that, got sorted out temporarily, but that agreement is still 19th November. So we'll have to see which way Russia goes now, or for instance, Ukraine goes now. That is why this discussion and the session today, in which the PM is also participating, is very critical and important.
Right. So, of course, critical meetings being held by the Prime Minister. And during that summit, Gargi is gone on to say that the world has to find a way to return to the path of ceasefire and diplomacy as far as Ukraine is concerned. So, strong words coming out of the Prime Minister at that G20 summit in Bali against the situation as far as Ukraine is concerned.
That's right. This meeting, this summit of world leaders and the major economies taking place in the shadow of the Ukraine war that's taking place. The session on food and energy security has taken place already, and the Prime Minister speaking at that spoke about having to return to the path of ceasefire and diplomacy in Ukraine, and that's especially key when we talk about food and energy security. Let's just take a look at this report.
A handshake between US President Joe Biden and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping, followed by a 3.5-hour-long meeting in Bali that led to some crucial statements from the two leaders. Most importantly, that nuclear war is out of question, a message sent clearly to President Putin from Bali, where the G20 countries have gathered for the 17th summit.
Reaffirmed our shared belief in the threat where the use of nuclear weapons is totally unacceptable.
The two also discussed Taiwan, as was expected, and while the US condemned the aggression by China, here's what the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson said was conveyed by President Xi to Biden. The Taiwan question is at the very core of China's core interests, the bedrock of the political foundation of China-US relations, and the first red line that must not be crossed in China-US relations. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Narendra Modi arrived to a traditional welcome in the island of Bali for the G20 summit. From December 1, India takes over the presidency of the grouping from Indonesia. This symbol, featuring a lotus, was revealed earlier and will be the banner under which the India summit will be held in New Delhi next year. Members of the G20 represent 85% of the global GDP and over 75% of global trade. What's more, the group accounts for 75% of the world's population. The talks this time in Bali come in the wake of uneven post-pandemic recovery. debt vulnerabilities, and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Specifically, in talks in Bali, the Prime Minister will participate in sessions on food, energy and security, digital transformation and health. Russia's President Vladimir Putin is absent from this G20 summit at a time when his country has suffered serious reverses in Ukraine, while Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky will make an appearance through a video link.
India takes on the presidency of G20 at a very critical juncture, when the war in Ukraine is far from over and the knock-on effects are being felt in both the energy and the food sector to the extent that it threatens to plunge the world into a deeper economic crisis. Can India, that has managed its relationship well and skillfully over this year, both with Russia and the West, be able to veer the two sides towards dialogue and diplomacy to make a success out of the September summit next year? In Nusa Dua, Bali, this is Maha Siddiqui for NDTV.
We have Maha joining us. Maha, ceasefire and diplomacy, strong words being used by the Prime Minister to show his support towards Ukraine. Take us through other issues that were also being raised.
The most important aspect, Divya, in fact, has been the Prime Minister's words clearly spelling out that richer countries or the Western countries cannot dictate terms to other countries on where they manage to get their energy from at this critical juncture. He said, we must not promote any restrictions on the supply of energy, and the stability in the energy market should be ensured. Strong words coming in there, because this is a forum that has the 20 biggest economies of the world. It has the European countries, it has US. So on this platform, for the Prime Minister to underline the fact that countries like India will continue to procure energy, oil from whichever is the cheapest source for them, considering that these are countries with not very high incomes, these are countries relying highly on energy sources. Therefore, it is important that they are not dictated terms on where to procure energy. On the aspect of food crisis, the Prime Minister has said that poor people, poor citizens of the world are suffering because of the essentials that are extremely expensive at this point. For some, the food crisis was such that they were even finding it hard to procure food, especially in terms of wheat, the crisis that we saw emanating because of the Ukraine war. He has said that we must not hesitate to acknowledge the fact that multilateral organizations like the United Nations have been unsuccessful in mitigating this crisis. A very clear stand there that is being taken by India. It has been spelled several times over by Indian diplomats, by even the External Affairs Minister. But for the Prime Minister to say that we must acknowledge the fact that the UN has not worked the way it should have in a crisis of this nature is certainly very significant.